the big news, of course, is this peace plan that has been put forward by Trump. Right. And for me, the biggest thing about this peace plan, it's just an admission from the West that it cannot sustain this conflict. I feel like this peace plan has taken the wind out of the sails for the Ukraine war effort, people.
Yeah, they're trying to get the wind back in the sails the best they can, and they may succeed. Again, I think Trump is behind this, but Trump is he blows one way and then he blows the other. That's the thing. But he has come back to this position, again and again, where there are moments of realism, and I think we're in one of them right now. He seems to recognize, maybe he talked to J.D. Vance, had some good long conversations with him or something. I'm not sure what it was, but he has come to realize that, the Ukrainians are losing, and I could have an Afghan moment or a Saigon moment on my hand, and I need to do something. Let's do this deal now. It's the 28-point peace plan. There are different versions out there, so we don't even really know which one is the real peace plan. There was one that was released by the Ukrainians. I think that was the one that came out earliest, and I've read over that a couple of times. But then there's another version that was published by The Telegraph, another version published by Reuters, and there's probably other versions floating around. Now, the funny thing with this so-called peace plan is that the way it is being reported or described in Western media is that it's basically that Trump gave everything to the Russians. So this was, there's even a story going around, I think, that was spread by General Kellogg's daughter, who is a very avid Ukraine supporter and actually lives in Ukraine, and said that it was written by the Russians. So this is, and then translated from Russian, into English. And that's just absurd. I've gone through it, and there's some things in there that the Russians would like, for example, no NATO membership. But there's a lot in there that they clearly are not going to agree to and did not come from that. There is talk about, retreating from the remaining 14% of Donbass, but in that they wouldn't actually have true sovereignty in that remaining 14%. They would not be allowed to send their troops in there. It would be a buffer zone. There is talk about a ceasefire down in Zaporozhye and Kherson, but it's not a temporary ceasefire, which is the way I think the Russians always understood it. We'll stop fighting for now, but these oblasts belong to us, and we'll negotiate how they're going to be returned to us. No, in this 28-point peace plan, it's permanent. So the Russians would give that up forever. There's a cap that's put on military forces, but it's 600,000. At least in this one version. I think in the Telegraph version, it's maybe 800,000. But it's funny how that's reported in the West. Like this would be a huge concession by the Ukrainians because they have a 1 million-man army. I think it's well understood they don't, and we can see it, what's happening on the front. They don't have 600,000 men on the front right now. If they did, we wouldn't be seeing the Russian advances that we are seeing right now. But that is, I think that's a cap that would be too high, according to the Russians. That's way too high, a 600,000-man army. And then also the Russians are supposed to give up control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which has been under the control since 2022. It would be actually administered by the IAEA, and the power generated from that would be split between Russia and Ukraine. There are other things, but I think the most important thing, there are other provisions that clearly the Russians wouldn't ever accept, but the most important thing is that at the very end, it says that this plan will be implemented and monitored by the Peace Council headed by Donald J. Trump. And that just looked at that and says, that's Gaza all over again. You see how they monitor and implement plans. So he gets to decide. In the end, it's like it doesn't even matter what you write down because he gets to interpret it all. and this is pretense that somehow, like in Gaza, that the U.S. is a neutral third party when they were actively complicit in that genocide. And if you want to point to one country that was responsible for sparking this war, I think, anyway, you can make the argument that it was the U.S. and the U.S. has been involved at every level, everything from satellite surveillance, all the way down to tactical direction and training and everything. We've gone through that. They've been so deeply involved in this war on the Ukrainian side, and now we're going to have. So one side gets to monitor it and implement it, and that's so the whole thing. I don't think this was written in Russian. Let's just put it that way.
Just to say the absurdity of it, the losing side, the side that loses, gets to monitor and interpret the plan. That's right. It's absurd. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Right.
But you're saying that even Europe is saying that this is somehow giving Russia everything.
Oh yeah.
Even though it seems to be the opposite in many ways.
Right.
I mean, especially like what you're talking about. Trump gets to decide everything at the end.
Yeah.
So, what is Europe saying? Is Europe saying we have to defeat Russia and we march on to Moscow? I mean,
well, they rushed out an alternative plan, which is basically just a ceasefire, but with the understanding that Russia would have to cede all the territories. And that, again, there can't be any prohibition on NATO membership. There can't be any cap on the.
So Russia has to lose, basically. Has to wave white flag
the reparations, and then no cap on the military, and nothing about protection for Russian language and Russian minorities and the Orthodox Church. That was there in vague fashion in the 28-point plan. It's just that both sides agree to abide by the principles of respect for linguistic and ethnic minorities or something. That was, I think, but clearly, again, it's just like the Europeans were supposed to do that when they admitted the Baltic states. And in the Baltic countries, the Russian minority has clearly, they are clearly second-class citizens. And they are not treated as full citizens. And clearly, that's in violation of EU principles. But it doesn't matter to the EU. So, anyhow. Yeah, so they, just like the media, basically they're saying this is terrible. This was written by the Russians, and their alternative plan is basically like the Kellogg ceasefire plan. Just we'll have a ceasefire, and then we'll get the Russians to agree to pull back from these territories. We'll negotiate with them and say, if you do this, we'll start to remove the sanctions. They seem to believe, both the Europeans and the Americans, that the Russians are absolutely desperate, that they want the sanctions to be removed, and that's a huge carrot that we can use and dangle over them. There's language in the 28-point peace plan that said that they will be removed gradually and on an individual basis. And say, like, if the Russians fall for that, it'll never happen. Again, they get to decide when they're removed, and they never will be removed. Probably not in our lifetimes. But the Russians have just accepted that, and they've gone on. Their economy has grown more since the outbreak of the war than the U.S. economy and the NATO economies, without question. They would probably like to have them lifted, but it's not existential for them.
This whole war it's been just so crazy watching, so frustrating, just seeing how that the West doesn't have any leverage, but they still are trying to dictate the terms, especially the Europeans, the ones that have zero leverage, and they're constantly trying to dictate terms and sabotage. And it's really frustrating because it's like, well, clearly what we're coming to this acknowledgement of this peace plan, like I said, was kind of an admission that they can't sustain the conflict. It's too expensive, running out of money, running out of weapons, running out of men. So we have to do this, but they don't. The terms are going to be dictated by the Russians because they won. They are winning, but there's just no acknowledgement of this. I just don't understand.
Right.
Like even let's say even if for some reason Russia says, okay, we'll agree to it. How are you, the West, supposed to even enforce anything like this? You lost the war. What are you going to do if Russia says like, oh, you guys aren't upholding your bargain, we're continuing to march? Right. What are you going to do? Go to war with them? That's what you're doing now. You're going to put sanctions on them? You've already tried that. Like there is no, it has to be, Russia has to dictate the terms, and they have to make the West accept it. That's how it works, right? And we keep on playing this game where somehow the losing side is going to dictate the terms.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, they won't admit that they're the losing side. Clearly there is some realism that's penetrated into the White House. I think there are occasional flashes of realism in Donald Trump's brain. J.D. Vance has shown, when it comes to Ukraine, he has shown an awareness of the reality there over time, even going back, well before the time that he was elected or entered into office as vice president. But in European capitals, with, of course, the exception of Hungary and Slovakia, and maybe to a lesser extent the Czech Republic, there's just no realism. They still are living in this fantasy world, and they find themselves kind of unable to escape it. They're just living in this dream world, this la la land, where they get to, Russia is still the Russia of the 1990s, and back then it was. Well, sometimes we forget that it was not just Putin that complained about like the expansion of NATO. Yeltsin did too. And he would bring it up. He said, this is bad. We're very worried about this. There are a lot of, you've got to stop this. And they just say, yeah. And, there are reports that would come back to Clinton and the White House and other, and State Department officials and other officials within Europe about this. The Russians are very upset. This is this is creating real problems. They find this completely unacceptable. And they say, yeah, I kind of understand their point of view, but who cares? They're a third-rate power. I mean, I think that was the language that was actually used by some of the officials. And that was the attitude. And it seems like they just can't, they still, everything has changed, but they just can't escape that mindset. They still live there, but it's become increasingly absurd. It's amazing that they hold on to it. I think it's because that mindset is very tightly wedded to a sense of moral superiority. And often when I read these articles talking about this is terrible, that Trump put forward this plan, it's very, very moralistic. Russia is the evil aggressor and Ukraine is the innocent victim, and we have to stand on side of the innocent victim. There's a complete lack of realism there. And it's just this, if you live in a world of morality where somehow by some coincidence, you're the good guys and the other people are the evil, then you can't compromise with evil. So this is just incomprehensible. I think that's the flip side of it. And these two things work together. Is this kind of habit of superiority that goes back to the 1990s and certainly before. But then this kind of this sense of moral purity that cannot be besmirched by actually compromising with the evil people on the other side. Now, of course, I think again, it's like this kind of let's say, morality, if you want to call it. I think it's a very false morality. But yeah, it is a false morality because it's unmoored from reality. And that kind of morality in the end produces horrible outcomes. And it's destroying Ukraine. You say that if you actually love Ukraine, if you love the people of Ukraine and you want to spare them, you need to be realistic and understand what the real choices are, what the real options are. I saw just recently, it was actually, I think it was maybe an X post written by the former press secretary of Zelensky, a Ukrainian, who was very much a Ukrainian patriot. She's saying she's just sick of hearing all this. She said, look, our men are dying out there and they're going to keep on dying. The Russians are winning and this is the best that we're going to get. If if for the sake of Ukraine, accept this. That's what she was saying. And she's completely right. It's just like if you go back, we've talked about this, that, look, offers have been made to Ukraine again and again by the Russians before the war, right after the war, and each time the terms from Russia are worse for Ukraine. What makes you think that a year from now is somehow going to be better? That what's inevitable, of course, is many more Ukrainians will die, more Ukrainian territory will be lost, and that any sort of peace plan offered by Russia is going to be even harsher. Is there any reason to believe that's not true? Is it the 20th sanctions package that's going to do it? As I don't know, it may be. Occasionally Scott Bessent says something that was true. It was him or somebody, another U.S. official. It says that if you have a 19 sanctions package, that tells you right there that it's not working. Right. That's what it is. But it's going to be the 20th that does it, or the 21st. And it's going to be the Taurus missile that does it. We've heard all this, and you say, come on, people, reality, and it's real morality is founded on morality, right? It's not just a question of, what the deal you can get for Ukraine now, but it also says, okay, let's look at this realistically and make an effort, instead get off of our higher moral ground, where the Russians are just, evil orcs and we're saints and, with shining halos above our head, and stop and really ask some hard questions. Like, maybe we provoked this war. Maybe we made some mistakes that helped to lead up to this war. There's a complete refusal to do that because they're obsessed with the sense of moral purity, and that any hard questions, insistence on looking at the reality is treated again as some sort of Russian plot. And as long as they're in that kind of mindset, they're not going to get out of this delusion. They seem to be very, very show no signs of escaping from it at this point.
Yeah, well, the European elite, they have that coupled with this notion of U.S. military supremacy. So there's just this idea that I think that, okay, we have the moral position here, or we got to fight the Russians, but, maybe we're not that strong, but our best friend, our ally is the most powerful country in the world. So we can win any war. So we just have to hang in there, and then we can get the U.S. in there. And so it's this problem, I think, of U.S. military supremacy that they also cannot admit, and they can't. And so they're just thinking that, like, we have the moral position and we have the military might position. But the reality is that they don't have either.
Right.
And then they can't admit it. But I think many of them, they just cannot accept the fact that the U.S. is not the dominant military power on the globe.
I think that's probably true within Ukraine, too. It's just this sense that, well, okay, the Americans have helped us and sent us weapons, but they have held back because clearly we know that, they are the supreme power. And if they really wanted to win this war on our behalf, they would send us these super weapons and the quantities that we need, or they would directly intervene. I think there is that belief, both within Ukraine and the rest of Europe. I think you get more realism in the U.S. more. There are a lot of people who obviously believe that in the U.S. The majority, I'd say, certainly of the elites and the general population as well. But there are a lot of people in the Pentagon that actually know, how many weapons are left in the warehouses and how many they can produce, and they know how the weapons they've sent already have fared on the battlefield. Like what was it just the other day that some 5 ATACMS were fired into Russia, and all of them were shot down. The Americans are going to know that, and they're going to be talking about that among themselves. And I think occasionally that truth just rises to the top, gets through to the president and other decision makers.
There's some talk about Trump wanting to freeze this conflict and end this conflict in Ukraine so he can pivot somewhere else, either to Asia, to Venezuela. What do you think about that? Is that? I mean, as crazy as it sounds, it does feel like there are more China war hawks that are really brewing, and we're seeing, Takaichi getting a little chipper over there in Japan with China, so over Taiwan. So do you think that there's something at play there that we're?
Yeah, well, there clearly is a very powerful faction within the State Department and the Pentagon that really wants to focus on China and sees the Ukraine war. I don't know how powerful they are, but there is a faction. There are people like that, and they do want to make that pivot to China. They see China as enemy number one. They understand. Originally a lot of them were for the Ukraine war because the idea was that, okay, we'll use this to severely weaken Russia, and maybe even achieve regime change, get a new kind of Yeltsin-like regime in there that we can control, and then we'll be strengthened vis-a-vis China. There were some that said that. We read the opinion pieces in the papers about that. Now they see that that's just not working, and so they say, well, let's just get out of here. And that's not a majority view, but that is there. Who was it? His name escapes me at the moment, but it was an assistant secretary not of defense, but rather of war, that has always been a China hawk and has been pushing that position. So yeah, there is always that possibility, and that argument is always floating around, within the top ruling circles.